Okay, let's dive into something really quite striking today. Imagine hearing this claim. One single country, just in the space of about, what, 10 or 11 years, manages to lift 171 million people out of extreme poverty.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just a small figure. It's like the population of several large countries combined. It paints this incredibly powerful picture, doesn't it? Almost like witnessing a massive economic magic trick.
It really is a remarkable image, and one that suggests just incredible progress. This particular claim, it comes from a major global financial institution, and they were looking at data right up to 2022-23.
Okay.
And the numbers they put forward are pretty significant. They're suggesting India's overall poverty rate plummeted, like from 27.1% back in 2011-12, way down to just 5.3% in 2022-23.
5.3%? That's huge.
It is. And for extreme poverty, using their specific threshold, the figure reportedly dropped to just 2.3%. Really low.
Wow. Okay, just hearing those numbers, I mean, it sounds like absolutely phenomenal news, right? Something genuinely worth celebrating on a huge scale, if that's the full story. It implies India's made just unprecedented strides against this massive, long-standing challenge.
Yes, the headline numbers, they're undoubtedly positive. And they certainly point towards some important shifts happening.
But, well, as we often find in these deep dives, there's usually more to explore beneath the surface. These figures, impressive as they sound at first, they also bring up a whole lot of questions when you start to look a bit closer.
Mhm.
So our goal today is really to dig into the information we have, look beyond those big top-line figures, and try to understand the nuances, What complexities, what questions lie underneath this picture of poverty in India?
Precisely. It's not just about the number itself, but how that number was reached and what other information, what other context helps complete that picture. You need the whole story.
Right. So let's start with something that, well, feels a little bit paradoxical, maybe. We're talking about these poverty rates dropping dramatically by 2022-23.
Yes.
But if you just rewind a couple of years, say back to around 2020, the narrative felt very different. I mean, didn't many estimates back then suggest a significant increase in poverty, like millions potentially falling back below the line because of the huge economic shockwaves from the global pandemic?
That is a crucial point to bring in, absolutely. The information we've looked at, it includes various estimates suggesting the pandemic could have pushed, well, anywhere from 75 million up to maybe even 230 million additional Indians into poverty,
Yeah.
primarily due to job losses, economic disruption. It was a huge shock.
230 million, that's staggering.
It is, and one specific estimate highlighted that India alone might have accounted for something like 56 million people falling into poverty, contributing to a global rise of about 71 million just in 2020.
Okay, so you have this massive estimated increasing poverty in 2020. How do we then square that very difficult, very recent period of hardship with a report showing such a dramatic reduction just 2 or 3 years later, getting down to these really low figures?
Yeah.
I mean, is it realistically possible for livelihoods and economic security to bounce back that fast for so many people after that kind of shock? It just feels incredibly rapid.
It certainly seems remarkably swift looking at it on the surface. And this apparent paradox, this tension, it leads us straight to why methodology is so important here. How are these latest numbers actually calculated? Because the way you measure something fundamentally shapes the result you get, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's like, using a different yardstick. You'll get a different measurement, even if the thing you're measuring hasn't fundamentally changed.
Exactly that. So one key element here is the poverty line itself, the international benchmark for extreme poverty. This global institution recently adjusted it upwards. Yes, it moved from $2.15 a day to $3 a day. Now, logically, if you raise the standard for what it means not to be poor, you make the bar higher, you'd naturally expect more people to fall below that line, right?
Uh-huh.
Not fewer.
Right, yeah. It's like increasing the minimum score you need to pass an exam. You'd assume fewer students would pass, not more.
Precisely. But here's the counterintuitive bit. Even with that threshold raised to $3 a day, the reported number of people in extreme poverty actually went down to that 2.3% figure, which definitely seems odd and requires a closer look at the underlying data and exactly how these comparisons are being drawn over time.
Okay, so the rising poverty line, but somehow falling poverty numbers. That's one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
What else about the actual data collection process for this latest report stands out?
Well, the numbers come from India's Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the HCES, for the period 2022-23. And it's really important to understand that this particular survey, well, It wasn't conducted in exactly the same way as the ones before it. There were some pretty significant changes in the methodology.
Changes like what? What specifically changed?
We're talking about differences in the actual questions people were asked. They used new sampling methods to select households. And there was a shift in how they tracked spending periods. This latest survey used something called the Modified Mixed Reference Period, or MMRP.
MMRP, okay. What does that mean in practice?
It basically means that for different types of goods and services, people were asked about their spending over different time frames. Maybe the last 7 days for food items, but the last 365 days for durable goods or clothing.
Hmm.
This is different from how previous surveys might have collected that information.
Ah, I see.
And when you change these fundamental aspects of how you gather the data, comparing the results directly to older surveys, like the key one from 2011-12, it becomes really complex. It's not quite apples to oranges, but maybe, like you said, apples to pears. They're both fruit, but inherently different in structure.
That makes a lot of sense. If you change the recipe for collecting the data, the final dish might taste different, not because the ingredients changed dramatically, but just because the cooking method did. So direct comparisons become difficult.
They certainly add a significant layer of complexity when you're trying to interpret big shifts over a decade or more.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another sort of historical point raised by the information available. There was an earlier HCES survey conducted back in 2017-18.
Okay.
Now, according to some reports, that survey actually indicated a decline in rural consumption, which would generally suggest rising hardship.
Mm.
But notably, that specific survey, well, it wasn't officially released or used for poverty comparisons for quite some time.
Really? It wasn't released?
That's the information available, yes.
Yeah.
And this history surrounding survey data, it adds another dimension to understanding the numbers presented now from the 2022-23 report. It can raise questions about data consistency and transparency over the longer term.
Okay, so you've got significant changes in the methodology for the latest survey, potentially making comparisons tricky. And you've got this backdrop of a previous survey, possibly showing less positive trends that wasn't released. It definitely makes these very positive recent numbers feel less straightforward than they might appear just looking at the headline.
It really highlights why relying solely on one headline figure from one specific report can sometimes be, well, potentially misleading when you're trying to assess something as complex and multifaceted as poverty across a huge and diverse population like India's.
Right. And that brings us neatly to the very definition of poverty itself, doesn't it? We've been talking about numbers based on a daily spending threshold, currently $3 a day for this extreme poverty measure. But is living on, say, $3.10 a day truly being out of poverty in a meaningful sense? Does it provide a life of dignity, security, real opportunity?
That's really the core question, isn't it? Economic survival, just getting by day to day, is one thing. But genuine human well-being is something much broader. Simply crossing a very low-income threshold doesn't automatically mean you have reliable access to essentials like good health care, or quality education for your kids, or stable, decent work.
So what else should we be looking at?
Well, the information we've reviewed points to other international rankings and indicators. And these offer a much broader perspective on the overall quality of life and development in India. They look beyond just daily spending power.
Okay, like what kind of indicators? What else helps fill out the picture?
We see rankings that measure different dimensions. For example, India ranks somewhere around 144th globally when it comes to per capita income. On the Human Development Index, the HDI, which combines health, education, and income measures, it's ranked 130th.
130th.
Then you have the Global Hunger Index, which specifically looks at malnutrition and hunger levels, placing India at 105th. And if you look at the UN's broader Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which cover a really wide spectrum of social and environmental factors, India is ranked 112th.
Wow. So while one specific poverty number, that 2.3% figure, might look fantastic in isolation, these other broader international rankings, they paint a picture with still quite significant, persistent challenges, especially in areas fundamental to a secure and fulfilling life, like health, education, nutrition.
Exactly. It's like, acing one small pop quiz, but still facing major hurdles on the big final exams when it comes to overall human well-being and development.
Yeah, that makes sense.
These other indicators show that reducing extreme poverty, when measured by a very low spending benchmark, is just one piece, and an important piece, yes, but just one piece of a much larger, much more complex puzzle. And even for those millions who have managed to move just above that specific low threshold, their situation can remain incredibly precarious.
Precarious how? What makes it so vulnerable?
Well, many people might be living just fractionally above that $3 a day line, maybe $3.70, maybe $4. But this doesn't mean they have any real financial cushion, any savings, any resilience to shocks.
Right.
So one unexpected event, a sudden illness in the family requiring expensive medical treatment, a bad harvest if they rely on farming, the loss of a daily wage job could very easily pull them right back down into severe hardship. They're essentially, as you hear sometimes, walking an economic tightrope. They haven't fallen off yet, maybe, but there's no safety net underneath them to catch them if they stumble.
That tightrope analogy really lands. It captures that sense of constant vulnerability. And what about inequality? Does that play a significant role in this broader picture as well?
Oh, absolutely. The information we have really highlights this. Even if the very lowest income levels are rising slightly for some people, the gap between the richest and the poorest in India remains vast, extremely wide.
How wide are we talking?
The sources we looked at mention that the top 10% of earners in the country make something like 13 times more than the bottom 10%. That level of disparity is a huge challenge for overall development, for social cohesion, for mobility.
13 times. That's a big gap.
It is. And while there are important welfare programs in place, things like the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the NREGA, or the Food Security Initiatives providing subsidized grains, which are absolutely crucial supports for millions. Some perspectives suggest these act more like, well, Band-Aids.
Band-Aids, meaning
Meaning they're essential for providing immediate relief and preventing absolute destitution, which is vital. But they don't necessarily fundamentally alter the underlying systemic conditions that create such wide inequalities and persistent vulnerability in the first place. They provide a floor, perhaps, but don't necessarily build the ladder up.
because they might not address the deeper issues like unequal access to quality education or healthcare or assets or opportunities.
Precisely. And that whole situation is further complicated by deeply entrenched social barriers. Things like caste discrimination, gender inequality. These continue to limit opportunities and trap certain groups in cycles of disadvantage almost regardless of what the overall GDP growth figures might say.
Okay, so it's a really complex web. We have these impressive headline numbers on extreme poverty from one source, but they become much more complicated when we factor in the changes in how the data was collected, the history around data availability, these other international indicators showing ongoing challenges in health, education, hunger, and this huge issue of inequality and vulnerability.
Yes. And there's also another dimension worth touching on, how data itself is sometimes presented and, perhaps more importantly, how it's received.
How do you mean?
Well, it's interesting how the reception of different data points can vary, apparently depending on what story they tell. There's an observation noted in the sources we reviewed of a tendency perhaps to very enthusiastically highlight and promote statistics that show positive trends like these recent poverty reduction figures.
Okay, makes sense to share good news.
Of course. But the observation continues. There seems to be a simultaneous tendency to be quite critical of, or sometimes even outright dismiss, reports or data that show negative or more challenging trends.
Dismissing them how? Like, what's the justification given?
Often by labeling them as unscientific, or citing supposed methodological flaws, or just generally casting doubt on their validity when the numbers aren't painting a favorable picture. The contrast is quite noticeable according to these observations. When, say, a World Bank report suggests poverty is way down, it's widely celebrated. But when, for example, the Global Hunger Index ranks India relatively poorly, maybe at 105th, that report is frequently challenged quite strongly on its methodology or its data sources.
It is striking how questions about methodology seem to surface most vocally when the data isn't particularly flattering, isn't it?
It certainly complicates the landscape if you're trying to get a clear, unbiased understanding of genuine progress. I mean, transparency in how data is collected, how it's analyzed, how it's presented, that's absolutely fundamental for effective policymaking, right?
Absolutely. You need honest feedback.
Exactly. And if critical reports or inconvenient data points are too readily dismissed or attacked, it makes it much harder to honestly assess which policies are truly working, where the real needs and vulnerabilities still lie, and where future efforts should be focused for the maximum positive impact. This kind of selective approach to data can make navigating the true landscape of poverty and development quite challenging.
Okay. So, if the numbers alone are complex, maybe even contested, and they certainly don't provide the complete picture, what does the information we've reviewed suggest are the really key areas that India needs to focus on for future progress? What emerges from this deeper look into the data, the indicators, the context?
Based on the materials we've gone through, several crucial areas really stand out. First, perhaps obviously, is creating stable, secure livelihoods. It's not just about any job, it's about generating quality jobs. Jobs that offer security, decent wages, maybe some benefits.
Not just temporary or precarious work.
Precisely. And while the service sector in India is growing, there's a strong argument that focusing on strengthening the manufacturing sector could potentially create the kind of mass employment needed for really broad-based, sustainable poverty reduction.
Okay, so quality jobs, maybe with a manufacturing focus. What else?
Second, significantly strengthening social safety nets. As we discussed, existing programs like the Rural Jobs Guarantee and food subsidies are vital. They provide a crucial floor for millions. But thinking about moving towards more comprehensive, perhaps universal systems, things like universal access to quality health care or more robust unemployment support, could provide a much sturdier buffer. It could prevent people from sliding back into poverty during inevitable shocks like illness or economic downturns, the kind of things we saw devastate livelihoods during the pandemic.
Right, building a much wider, stronger net beneath that economic tightrope we talked about.
Exactly that. Third, and this is critical, actively and aggressively tackling inequality. Addressing the deep-seated disparities based on caste, gender, geographic location. This isn't just a matter of social justice, though it is that too. It's increasingly seen as essential for sustainable economic development itself. Growth needs to be genuinely inclusive, and breaking down these systemic barriers is absolutely key to ensuring everyone has a real shot at benefiting from it.
Makes sense. And given our whole discussion about the numbers and how they're generated, improving the data itself must be on the list too.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The information really emphasizes the need for surveys that are consistent over time, transparent in their methods, and conducted frequently enough to track changes reliably. This means moving away from situations where survey results that might not fit a preferred narrative are questioned, delayed, or withheld. And it also means using multiple lenses, multiple benchmarks, to understand poverty. Looking beyond just that single extreme poverty line, like the $3 a day one. For example, using a slightly higher benchmark, like the $6.85 a day poverty line, which is often used for lower middle-income countries, paints a very different picture. According to some views using this line, around 28.1% of Indians were still poor in 2022-23.
28%. That's a vastly different number than 2.3%.
It is. And using these different measures provides a much more complete, more nuanced understanding of where people stand, how much vulnerability exists just above that very bottom line.
So multiple data points, different thresholds, more transparency, essential for a clearer view.
Yes. And finally, and perhaps encompassing all of this, is prioritizing holistic development. Looking solely at economic growth, just the GDP figures, it's increasingly recognized as insufficient. True, meaningful progress means simultaneously focusing on improving education outcomes, health standards, nutrition levels for children and adults, and even crucial environmental factors like access to clean air and clean water. India's ranking on those broader sustainable development goals serves as a constant reminder that these areas are just as fundamental as income levels to building a truly secure, resilient, and flourishing society for everyone.
Okay, this has been quite the journey, hasn't it? We started with this incredibly optimistic, almost startling headline figure suggesting a near eradication of extreme poverty in India by 2022-23 based on one specific report.
Yeah, a figure that, taken on its own, really paints a picture of a massive problem almost completely solved, almost miraculously so.
But by digging just a little deeper into the available information, we've seen that while there has certainly been genuine progress over the years and very important welfare programs are providing critical support to millions, the overall picture is far more complex, far more nuanced.
Definitely. The headline numbers themselves are complicated by these significant methodological changes in the latest survey, which, as we discussed, make direct comparisons over time quite tricky. You have to be careful.
And then you have all those other international indicators covering health, education, hunger, inequality, overall human development, which paint a much less uniformly positive picture. They highlight ongoing, deep-seated challenges and significant vulnerabilities still faced by millions of people.
Right. And we also touched upon how different kinds of data, showing different outcomes, are sometimes perceived and treated, which adds yet another layer of complexity if you're trying to understand the full, unvarnished situation.
All of that together, it really serves as a powerful reminder, doesn't it? That poverty isn't just a single statistic you can point to on a chart. It's deeply intertwined with the daily reality, the security, the opportunities, the stresses, and the fundamental dignity of millions upon millions of people.
It absolutely underscores the importance of demanding transparency in data, of looking beyond just the easy headlines and really trying to understand The layered, complex reality of development, especially in a country as vast, as diverse, and as dynamic as India.
Absolutely. Real progress, ultimately, it's measured not just in percentages reported in the study, but in the tangible, lived experiences and the improved well-being of individuals, families, and entire communities on the ground.
Well said.
So let's leave you, our listener, with this thought to maybe mull over as you encounter reports like this in the future. What does a truly developed nation actually look like to you? Is it primarily about achieving a very low poverty percentage based on a specific, maybe quite low income threshold on paper?
Or is it something more?
Or is it about ensuring a fundamental baseline of security, genuine opportunity, access to quality healthcare and education, and basic human dignity for everyone? Is it about actively addressing and narrowing those gaps highlighted by all the other data points we discussed and by the lived realities people face? What does progress really mean when we try to consider the full human picture, not just one potentially problematic number? Something to keep in mind.